Have you ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect you? I'm standing in a courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that smells like bleach and sweat and fear, and the judge, a woman with perfectly styled gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a gold chain around her neck, looks at me like I'm something she scraped off her shoe. The fluorescent lights are humming above us, that low electric buzz that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long, and I can hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, the kind of breathing you do when you're trying not to cry in front of strangers. My hands are cuffed in front of me, the metal cold against my wrists, and I'm thinking about how just 6 months ago I was sitting in a different room with different lighting, soft and warm, arranging flowers in a crystal vase for a charity luncheon, wearing pearls my husband gave me for our 10th anniversary. The judge reads my sentence without looking at me. 10 years. She says it, like she's ordering coffee. 10 years in a federal correctional facility. And I don't scream. I don't collapse. I just stand there nodding slightly, because somewhere deep inside me, underneath all that shame and terror, there's a tiny voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, this is what freedom looks like. But that was only the beginning. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, let me take you back. Let me show you who I was before the courtroom, before the orange jumpsuit, before the world decided I was guilty. I was Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. I grew up in a house in Connecticut where the hedges were always trimmed and the driveway was always swept, and no one ever raised their voice. My mother taught me how to set a table when I was 7 years old. The fork goes on the left, the knife blade faces inward, the napkin folded just so. And she taught me something else too, something she never said out loud, but I learned anyway. A woman's job is to make everything look easy, to smile when you're tired, to nod when you're angry, to say I'm fine when you're breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces inside. I married Michael when I was 23. He was older, 37, a corporate attorney with a corner office and a Harvard degree and hands that never got dirty. Our wedding had 200 guests and white roses everywhere and a cake that cost more than my first car. I wore my grandmother's veil. In the photographs, I'm smiling so wide you can see all my teeth, and if you look closely, really closely, you can see something else too. You can see a girl who thinks she's supposed to disappear. For 17 years, I disappeared. I learned how to laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. I learned how to cook salmon the exact way he liked it, with dill and lemon and just a hint of garlic. I learned how to dress for his firm's holiday parties. Nothing too tight, nothing too bright, always elegant, always appropriate. I learned how to ignore the phone calls he took at 2 in the morning, the receipts in his jacket pocket from restaurants we'd never been to together, the perfume smell that wasn't mine clinging to his collar. I learned how to be small, and then one day, I wasn't small enough. Have you ever felt something like this? That moment when you realize you've been holding your breath for so long you've forgotten what air tastes like? It was a Tuesday in March. I remember because the tulips in our garden were just starting to bloom, bright yellow against the brown earth, and I'd spent the morning pulling weeds with my bare hands, dirt under my fingernails, thinking about how nice it was to touch something real. Michael came home early. He never came home early. He had this look on his face, this careful, controlled expression that I recognized immediately. It was the look he wore when he was about to deliver bad news to a client, sympathetic but distant, like he was reading from a script. He sat me down at our kitchen table, the one made of reclaimed barnwood that cost $8,000, and he told me we had a problem, a financial problem. His voice was steady, clinical. He'd made some investments, high-risk investments, using our joint accounts. And things had gone wrong, very wrong. He needed me to do something for him. Just a signature, just a few documents, nothing I needed to worry about. He'd handle everything. He always handled everything. I signed because I'd spent 17 years being the kind of woman who signed, who trusted, who didn't ask questions, who believed that her job was to make everything easy. 6 weeks later, the FBI knocked on our door at 6 in the morning. The sun wasn't even up yet. They had a warrant. They went through everything. Our closets, our computers, our file cabinets, even the medicine cabinet in the guest bathroom. They took boxes and boxes of papers. They took our laptops. They took my phone. And when they were done, they took me. Just me. Not Michael. He stood in our driveway in his pajamas and bare feet, watching through the window as they put me in the back of their car, and his face was blank, completely blank, like he was watching a stranger. The charges were fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Michael's company had been running a scheme for years, funneling money through shell corporations, falsifying records, stealing from pension funds, from real people, teachers and firefighters and nurses who'd worked their whole lives and trusted that their retirement would be there when they needed it. And my signature was on dozens of documents: transfer authorizations, wire instructions, corporate filings. My name was everywhere. The prosecutors had emails I'd sent, bank statements I'd authorized, board minutes I'd apparently approved. The evidence was overwhelming. My lawyer, a tired man with coffee breath and a wrinkled suit, told me I had two choices: plead guilty and cooperate, maybe get 7 to 10 years, or go to trial and risk 25. He said it in the same tone someone might use to ask if you want cream in your coffee. I asked about Michael. Where was Michael in all this? My lawyer looked at me like I was a child asking why the sky is blue. Michael had immunity. Michael had cut a deal 6 months earlier. Michael had given them everything they needed to prosecute me in exchange for walking away clean. I laughed. I actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of something breaking. I took the plea deal. 7 years, later reduced to 10, with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for the amount of money involved. And that's how I ended up in that courtroom, wearing orange, listening to a judge sentence me to a decade behind bars for crimes I didn't even understand I was committing. But that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. The first night in prison, I didn't sleep. How could I? The cell was concrete and steel, everything hard and cold and echoing. My cellmate was a woman named Rosa who'd been inside for 4 years on drug charges. She had tattoos on her arms, these beautiful flowing designs of vines and flowers, and she barely looked at me when I came in. She just pointed to the top bunk and said, "You scream in your sleep, I'm gonna smother you with your pillow." Then she rolled over and went to sleep like it was nothing, like this was just life. I lay there on that thin mattress with its rough sheets and its smell of, industrial detergent, staring at the ceiling where someone had scratched words into the paint. God sees. And I thought about my house in Connecticut, my garden, my crystal vases, my perfectly set table, my husband's blank face watching me get arrested. And I thought, who was I protecting? What was I protecting? I'd spent 17 years making myself smaller and smaller and smaller until I'd disappeared completely, until I was just a signature on someone else's crime. And for what? For a marriage that was a performance? For a life that was a beautiful lie? I didn't cry that first night. I didn't cry for weeks. I was too angry. But it wasn't the hot, explosive kind of anger. It was cold. It was clear. It was the kind of anger that burns everything away until all that's left is truth. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. Prison has a rhythm. You learn it or you drown. Wake up at 5:30 when the lights slam on. Count. Breakfast at 6. Count. Work detail at 7. Count. Lunch at 11. Count. Recreation at 1. Count. Dinner at 4:30. Count. Lockdown at 9. Count. They count you like your inventory, like your objects on a shelf. And at first, it breaks you. That reduction, that constant reminder that you're not a person anymore, you're a number. Inmate 743921. That's who I was. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison didn't exist inside those walls. But here's what they don't tell you about prison. Here's what you can't understand until you're there. When you have nothing left to lose, when every single illusion has been stripped away, when you can't perform or pretend or disappear anymore, that's when you find out who you actually are. I got assigned to the prison library. It was a small room with fluorescent lights and metal shelves and maybe 3,000 books, most of them falling apart, pages yellowed and spines cracked. My job was to process new donations, repair damaged books, help inmates check things out. It was quiet work, solitary, which was exactly what I needed. I'd spent 17 years surrounded by noise, dinner parties and charity events and country club conversations, but I'd never actually heard myself think. Now I had nothing but time to think, time to read, time to learn, time to remember who I'd been before I became Mrs. Michael Morrison. I read everything: philosophy, history, poetry, psychology. I read Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison and bell hooks. I read Victor Frankl and James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. I read about women who'd survived wars and revolutions and betrayals. I read about freedom, not the kind of freedom that means you can go wherever you want, but the kind that means you know who you are, even when the world tells you you're nothing. And slowly, very slowly, something started to change inside me. Rosa became my friend, not right away. You don't make friends quickly in prison. Trust is currency, and everyone's broke. But after a few months of living 3 feet from each other, breathing the same air, listening to each other's nightmares, you either learn to be human together or you destroy each other. Rosa taught me things, practical things: how to tie my shoes so they wouldn't get stolen, how to walk in the yard without looking like prey, how to tell which guards were decent and which ones were dangerous. But she taught me other things too. She taught me that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. She taught me that dignity is something you carry inside you, not something someone can give you or take away. One night, maybe 6 months in, Rosa asked me why I was there. Not the charges. She knew the charges. Everyone knew everyone's charges. But why? What had really happened? I told her everything. About Michael. About the signatures. About the blank face in the driveway. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You know what your real crime was? You forgot you had a choice. You thought being loved meant making yourself small. But that ain't love. That's just fear with good lighting." I cried that night. Finally. Not sad crying, not scared crying, angry crying, the kind that shakes your whole body, the kind that leaves you empty and clean. Stay with me until the end. It's worth it. In my second year, they started a program, education classes for inmates who wanted to get their GED or take college courses. I already had a degree, art history, completely useless in the real world, Michael used to joke. But I signed up anyway. I took philosophy. I took creative writing. I took a class on women's studies taught by a volunteer professor from the local community college, a black woman in her 60s with silver locks and reading glasses covered in rhinestones who talked about power and patriarchy and internalized oppression like she was discussing the weather. Her name was Dr. Williams, and she changed my life. She assigned us to write about a moment when we felt most powerless. I wrote about that morning when the FBI came. I wrote about standing in my driveway in my bathrobe while strangers dismantled my life. I wrote about Michael's blank face. But then Dr. Williams asked us a follow-up question. When did you first start practicing powerlessness? When was the first time you chose silence over voice? I couldn't answer. Not at first. I went back to my cell and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about my childhood, about my mother's perfect table settings, about learning to smile when I wanted to scream, about every time I swallowed my own thoughts because they weren't convenient or appropriate or feminine enough, about every time I made myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. And I realized I'd been preparing to be a victim my entire life, not because anyone forced me, because I'd been taught that's what good women do. They accommodate. They defer. They disappear. I wrote 30 pages, single-spaced. Dr. Williams gave me an A+ and a note that said, "You have a voice worth hearing. Don't let anyone silence it again." In my 4th year, something happened that would have destroyed the old Sarah. There was a woman in my block named Jennifer. She was young, maybe 25, inside for writing bad checks. She was small and blonde and soft-spoken, and some of the other inmates targeted her because she looked like someone who'd break easy. One afternoon in the rec yard, 3 women cornered her by the fence. I was sitting on a bench reading. I was always reading, and I heard her crying. That specific kind of crying where you're trying to be quiet, trying not to attract attention, but you can't help it because you're so scared. The old Sarah would have looked away, would have told herself it wasn't her business, would have protected herself first, but I wasn't the old Sarah anymore. I stood up. I walked over. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just walked, calm and steady, and I stood next to Jennifer and I looked at those 3 women and I said, "Leave her alone." My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was just certain, like a door closing, like a period at the end of a sentence. And something in my face, maybe the years I'd spent learning not to be afraid, maybe the anger I'd finally learned to channel, maybe just the simple fact that I was willing to stand there and take whatever came next, made them back off. They called me names. They threatened me, but they left. And Jennifer grabbed my hand and squeezed it so tight I thought my bones would break. That night, Rosa said to me, "You know you just made yourself a target, right? Those girls won't forget." I said I knew. She asked why I did it. I said, "Because once upon a time someone should have stood next to me, and nobody did." Rosa smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her really smile. She said, "There she is. Took you long enough." And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. The next few years blurred together, not in a bad way, in the way time moves when you're actually living instead of just surviving. I read hundreds of books. I wrote thousands of pages. I took every class they offered. I learned Spanish from Rosa and sign language from a deaf woman named Carol, and how to fix cars from a former mechanic named Pat, who could rebuild an engine with her eyes closed. I learned how to be comfortable in silence, how to sit with difficult emotions instead of running from them, how to separate who I am from what happened to me. I learned about the other women, really learned not just their names and charges, but their stories. Teresa, who'd killed her husband after 20 years of abuse and never once apologized for it. Angela, who'd embezzled from her employer to pay for her daughter's cancer treatment. Kim, who'd gotten caught with drugs she was selling to keep her family fed after her factory job moved to Mexico. Every single woman in that place had a story that was more complicated than guilty or innocent. Every single one of them was more than the worst thing she'd ever done. And I learned something else, something important. Freedom isn't a place. It's not something you can lose because someone takes it away. Real freedom is knowing who you are when every external marker of identity is gone. When you're not somebody's wife or somebody's daughter or somebody's employee. When you can't hide behind your job or your house or your clothes. When it's just you and the truth. That's freedom. And I found mine in the last place I ever expected to look. In my 7th year, Michael filed for divorce. I got the papers in the mail, official and cold, with my name spelled wrong on the petition. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Not Morrison. Morrison. 1R. He'd been married to me for 17 years, and he didn't even know how to spell my name. I signed them. Didn't even read them. Just signed and sent them back. Rosa asked if I was okay. I said I was, and I meant it. Because I'd finally figured out what had taken me so long to see. I was never actually married. You can't be married to someone who doesn't see you. You're just performing marriage. And I was done performing. In my 8th year, my mother came to visit. First time in 8 years. She'd refused before, said she was too ashamed, too embarrassed. What would people think? But now she was older and sick. Breast cancer, stage 3. And I guess she decided dying mattered more than appearances. She sat across from me in the visiting room with its plastic chairs and vending machines and guard watching from the corner, and she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I'd changed. I knew I'd changed. I'd stopped straightening my hair. I'd stopped wearing makeup on visiting days. I'd stopped trying to look like the woman I used to be. My hair was gray at the temples. I had lines around my eyes. I was 46 years old, and I finally looked it. My mother said, "You look different." I said, "I am different." She said, "Are you angry with me?" And I thought about it. Really thought about it. Was I angry? She'd taught me to disappear. She'd taught me that a woman's value was in her service to others. She'd taught me to smile and accommodate and never, ever make a scene. She'd taught me to be a victim. But she'd also been a victim herself, hadn't she? Taught the same lessons by her mother, handed the same script, expected to perform the same role. I said, "No, I'm not angry, but I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not disappearing for anyone. Not even for you." She cried. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been wrong. She said she wished she'd taught me to be strong instead of small. And I believed her. But I also knew it didn't change anything. The past is the past. All we have is right now, this moment, and who we choose to be in it. She died 4 months later. I didn't get to go to the funeral. But I wrote her a letter before she passed. I told her I forgave her. I told her I understood. I told her I loved her. And I told her I was free. Finally, completely free. Not because I was getting out of prison, I still had 2 more years to serve, but because I'd stopped carrying her expectations, her fears, her limitations. I'd stopped carrying anyone's but my own. Share this with someone who would understand. In my 9th year, Dr. Williams came back to teach another class. She was older, moving slower, but her mind was still sharp as broken glass. This time, the class was called Narratives of Liberation. We read slave narratives and prison memoirs and testimonies from women who'd survived violence. We talked about how people take away your freedom by controlling your story, by telling you who you are, what you're worth, what you're allowed to want. And we talked about how you take it back, not by fighting their story, but by writing your own. She asked us to write about what we'd learned in prison, what we'd found, what we'd become. I wrote about shame, about how I'd carried shame like a second skin for years. Shame about not being perfect, not being enough, not being whatever impossible thing everyone expected. And I wrote about the day I finally put it down. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a big moment. I was just sitting in the library, reshelving books, and I picked up a copy of The Color Purple, and I opened it to a random page, and I read, "I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it." And something clicked. I'd spent my whole life walking by purple fields. I'd been so busy trying to be what everyone else needed that I'd forgotten to notice beauty, to notice myself, to notice anything real. Dr. Williams read my essay out loud to the class. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one woman started clapping, then another, then all of them. They clapped for me, not because I was special, but because they understood, because every single woman in that room had her own purple field she'd walked past, her own self she'd lost, her own shame she'd carried until she couldn't carry it anymore. Dr. Williams said to me, "When you get out, promise me something. Promise me you'll tell your story. Not for revenge, not to hurt anyone, but because someone needs to hear it. Someone is sitting in a house right now, signing papers she doesn't understand, making herself small for someone who doesn't see her. And your story might save her life. I promised." In my 10th year, I was eligible for early release. Good behavior, model inmate, all the boxes checked. My parole hearing was on a Thursday in September. The parole board, 3 people sitting behind a table with my file open in front of them, asked me the required questions. Did I take responsibility for my actions? Yes. Did I understand the harm I'd caused? Yes. Had I been rehabilitated? They asked it like rehabilitation was something that happened to you, like a treatment, like medicine. I said, "I don't know if I've been rehabilitated, but I've been transformed. I came in here as someone who didn't know her own value. I'm leaving as someone who does." They granted my parole. I'd serve out the rest of my sentence on supervised release. I'd have restrictions, where I could live, where I could work, who I could associate with, but I'd be out. After 10 years, I'd be out. The day I walked out of prison, it was raining. Soft. Rain, the kind that's more mist than water. Rosa walked me to the gate. We didn't say much. What was there to say? We'd lived together for 10 years. She'd seen me at my worst and my best. She'd taught me how to survive, how to be strong, how to be human. I hugged her tight and she whispered in my ear, "Don't forget who you are out there. Don't let them make you small again." I said I wouldn't. I meant it. I walked through that gate carrying a plastic bag with my belongings, some books, some letters, some photographs, and I stood on the sidewalk in the rain, breathing free air for the first time in 10 years. It smelled like earth and exhaust and possibility, and I thought about what freedom actually means. Not the absence of walls, not the ability to go wherever you want, but the presence of choice. The knowledge that you get to decide who you are and what matters and what you'll accept and what you'll walk away from. I didn't have much. No money, no job, no house. My mother was dead. My husband had remarried. I'd heard through the prison grapevine. I had nothing except myself, and that was everything. I got a job at a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated women transition back into society. I help them find housing, apply for jobs, navigate the bureaucracy of parole. I teach financial literacy classes. I teach them how to spot the signs of abuse, financial control, manipulation. I teach them what I learned, that your signature on a document matters, that your voice matters, that you matter. Some of them are angry. Some are broken. Some are just tired. I understand all of it. I've been all of it. I also started writing, not just for myself, for others. I wrote an essay about my experience and submitted it to a magazine. They published it. Then another magazine asked for a piece. Then another. I started getting letters from women who'd read my story, women in similar situations, women who'd signed papers they didn't understand, women who'd made, themselves small for men who didn't deserve them, women who thought they were alone. I wrote back to every single one. I told them the truth. You're not alone. You're not broken. You're not beyond repair. You're just beginning. Last month, I got a letter from Michael. His return address was a law firm in Manhattan. Inside was a check for $150,000 and a note. Restitution. My lawyer says I should do this. Not sorry. Not, I was wrong. Not, I destroyed your life. Just, my lawyer says I should do this. I looked at that check for a long time. I thought about depositing it, about using it to pay off debt, to get a better apartment, to start over. And then I thought about who I'd become in those 10 years. About the woman who'd learned that freedom isn't something you buy. It's something you claim. I tore up the check. I wrote Michael a letter. I said, I don't want your money. I don't want your guilt. I don't want anything from you except for you to know this. You didn't break me. You set me free. Thank you. I meant it. Not because I forgave him, but because I'd stopped needing his apology to move forward. I'd stopped needing anything from him at all. This is what I learned in 10 years in prison. We spend our whole lives building prisons for ourselves. We build them out of fear and shame and other people's expectations. We build them out of the belief that love means sacrifice, that goodness means silence, that strength means never asking for help. We build them so carefully, so thoroughly, that we forget we're the ones holding the key. We forget we could walk out anytime we choose. I spent 10 years in prison, and yes, I lost things. I lost time. I lost my marriage, my house, my reputation, my freedom, or at least what I thought freedom was. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained myself, the real Sarah, Not the one who sets perfect tables and smiles at unfunny jokes and signs papers without reading them, but the one who stands up, who speaks up, who takes up space, who knows her worth, who walks through rain and breathes and chooses and lives. People ask me if I'm angry about what happened, if I'm bitter, if I wish I could go back and change things, and the answer is no, not anymore. Because that decade in prison gave me something that 17 years of marriage never did. It gave me the clarity to see who I'd been, a woman performing someone else's script, and the courage to become who I was always meant to be. A woman who knows that respect isn't given, it's claimed. A woman who knows that dignity isn't about what others think of you, but what you think of yourself. A woman who knows that the door to your cage has always been unlocked. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it. So no, I'm not angry. I'm grateful. I passed 10 years in prison, and there, in the last place I ever expected, surrounded by concrete and steel, and women the world had forgotten, I found my liberation. Not from the walls, from myself, from every lie I'd believed about who I was supposed to be, from every chain I'd wrapped around my own wrists. Freedom doesn't erase the past. It doesn't undo the harm or erase the scars. It simply teaches us how to breathe again, how to stand tall, how to walk through the world knowing that we are enough exactly as we are in this moment, with all our flaws and failures and beautiful, terrible truth. And that, I've learned, is worth everything. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here. And don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.